Welcome to the Read, Talk, Grow podcast, where we explore health topics through books. Our topic today is Huntington's disease, and our book is Inside the O'Briens by Lisa Genova. I'm your host, Dr. Denise Milstein. I'm an assistant professor of medicine at Mayo Clinic, where I practice women's health, internal medicine, and integrative medicine. I am so excited to welcome Lisa Genova back to the show. Lisa is a New York Times bestselling author of several books and has degrees in neuroscience from Harvard and biopsychology from Bates College. Her TED Talks on Alzheimer's disease and memory have been viewed over 11 million times. Lisa is a true phenomenon in popular culture and brain health. Lisa, welcome back to the show.
Oh, Denise, thank you so much for having me back.
Dr. John Caviness is a professor of neurology at Mayo Clinic College of Medicine and Science and a consultant in the Department of Neurology at Mayo Clinic in Arizona. His clinical practice focuses on movement disorders such as Parkinson's disease, myoclonus, and Huntington's disease. John, welcome to the show.
Thank you. My pleasure to be here.
Inside the O'Briens is a modern family story set in Massachusetts. Boston cop Joe O'Brien is a Red Sox loving family man with a spunky wife, Rosie, and four young adult children when his odd behavior is noticed by a colleague. After evaluation and testing, Joe is diagnosed with Huntington's disease, an inherited neurodegenerative progressive movement disorder that we're going to learn more about today. So, you both know how Read Talk Grow works. We discuss books that portray health topics in an effort to better understand health experiences. In this case, one that maybe many people are not quite as familiar with. We explore these experiences through story, and today we're going to be talking about Huntington's disease. So, Lisa, as mentioned, you already joined us on Read Talk Grow to discuss your 2025 release, More or Less Maddie, where we talked about bipolar disorder in episode number 46. Thank you again for that amazing conversation.
Oh, thank you. It was one of the first conversations I had for that book tour, and it remains my favorite.
Well, thank you for that. While I was preparing for that episode interview, actually, I reconnected with an old friend. Her name is Candace. She's a hockey mom with me. And I was telling her about the podcast, and she said, my family has a history of Huntington's. And I read this book many years ago, and it was the first time I saw my family's experience reflected in a novel. And let me tell you, that was enough of an endorsement for me. I knew you and your work, and I said, we have to talk about this book to honor these families who navigate this really difficult disease. So I wonder if you'll tell us your inspiration for writing this book now many years ago.
I know. I was writing this book back in 2013, 2014. It was published in 2015. So it's, over 10 years ago that I was really embedded in the Huntington's community and learning from them. I wanted to write about Huntington's. Well, first, my background in neuroscience is what excites me. And I am committed to a career of writing stories about people living with neurological diseases and disorders, mental illness, anything going on in the brain that renders folks ignored, feared, misunderstood, alienated, isolated for what's going on in their brains. Because story is a great, super powerful way for people to get educated from a place of empathy and compassion. So you learn not just information intellectually, you learn how to feel about these folks, the lived felt experience. And so at that point in my career, I had written about Alzheimer's, traumatic brain injury, and autism. And I had generated a bit of a following, and I wanted to write about Huntington's because I knew about Huntington's as a neuroscientist, but I recognized that most people didn't. And I thought that maybe this would be a chance to raise some much needed urgent awareness around this illness that doesn't affect as many people as Alzheimer's, say. So, like, I think right now in the US, we have something like 7 million people diagnosed with Alzheimer's. And at any given moment, the prevalence of Huntington's is usually around 40,000 in the US. So, if you're a drug company, what disease are you motivated to go after? The market potential for Alzheimer's is, of course, much more. And so Huntington's at least in terms of research, gets less attention. And then just personally, I was 22 years old. It was my first job out of college. I was working as a lab tech at Mass General East in the Charlestown Navy Yard. And this is why I set the book in Charlestown as a nod to what I'm about to share. I was doing research on the molecular neurobiology of drug addiction. But the research building used to be a building that they housed the naval ships could come in and be cleaned on the interior. It was all balconies. And so the length of this building is massive, and they never walled it off and made separate rooms, if you will. Like the lab benches are, it's the length of the building, and it's just lab bench after lab bench as far as the eye can see. And so it was February of 93 when all of a sudden some neuroscientists, many, many lab benches down, start screaming and celebrating and crying and cheering. And like, so, I probably had my pipette midair and stop. And we all are sort of like, what's happening? Like, neuroscientists don't behave this way. And the news trickles down that those neuroscientists had just isolated the genetic mutation that causes Huntington's.
Wow.
Yeah, so I'm 22. I'm an aspiring neuroscientist. I get full body goosebumps. I recognize that this is a historic moment in all of science. And I somewhat naively jumped to the next thought was, oh my God, there's only one thing that causes Huntington's. It's this genetic mutation. They've just isolated it. They're gonna cure this disease. And while that's still the hope, knowing that genetic mutation is necessary for getting us to a cure for this disease, we are all these decades later, and we still don't have that. So that's why I wanted to write this story, is to let people know what Huntington's is and how close we could be to solving it if we had maybe some more attention on it.
That's so fascinating. Talk about being in a really remarkable place at such a time. How interesting. John, tell us your impression of the book and also what it's like to work clinically with patients affected by Huntington's.
Sure. Well, first of all, I mean, I thought the book was excellent. So really, Lisa, congratulations again. And I, thought that for, a couple of different reasons. First of all, those of us in medicine, when we see a disease portrayed, it's not uncommon for it to be kind of overplayed or overdone or dramatized or something like that. And this book wasn't like that at all. I mean, I thought it was very real. It was very accurate. And after 33 years of taking care of patients with Huntington's disease, it was like, this is what I've lived for the last 33 years. That was very impressive to me, and I wasn't, prepared for quite that. The second thing I would say is that, the book excellently portrayed Huntington's disease as a family affliction. Now, you could always say, when one person in a close family gets a disease or condition, of course it affects everybody else. But for me, in Huntington's disease, the family is affected in a much more intense way than just simply having a member of the family afflicted with a certain condition or disorder. It truly is a family affliction or a family disease in a very intense way. And I thought the book did an excellent job of portraying that. The third thing I would say is that at the end of the book, I thought was, I'm not trying to shower you, Lisa, with compliments, but at the end of the book, I thought it was very well done because at the end, Katie makes a decision that she wants the test results, but the book ends right there. And so the readers never really told her the test results. But hope readers would realize that, the test result doesn't matter. What really mattered was Katie's journey to get to that point. And that was so excellently portrayed is that, I thought that was just, extremely well done.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, there were a fair number of readers who were angry with me for not telling them what her gene status was, like whether she was positive or negative for the mutation. And what you are just articulated is exactly the point. Like for Katie, her journey was recognizing that she's at the beginning of her life and she's going to live it. And whatever is going on inside her, she doesn't have a disease now. She might someday, but like all of us, we don't know what the future holds in our genetic predispositions and what will happen. So for her, it was getting to the point of, I don't need to know. I'm going to make the choices I'm going to make, regardless of what that outcome is. And I had also given the reader other examples from her siblings of what it's like to sit across from that genetic counselor and get a gene positive result and what to do with that, how it affects the family dynamic between siblings. And I talked to a lot of folks who didn't want to know. So we're now talking about, like, if you mom or dad has Huntington's, each kid has a 50-50 shot of inheriting the mutation that will 100% cause Huntington's. And because of that discovery in 1993 in the Charlestown Navy Yard, there's a blood test where you can just go and get a simple blood draw and find out if you've got the genetic mutation that will give you Huntington's. And so the generation at risk, so all of the kids of this family, are saddled with this really daunting question of, do you want to know? And I went into the research for this book kind of feeling black and white about it. I thought, well, I'd want to know. Information is good, and then I can plan accordingly, and then I can get involved in clinical trials if I'm gene positive. And that's sort of just how I would approach it. But as I talked to all the people I talked with, I recognized how gray this is, that there is no black and white, and there are very good reasons to find out. There are excellent reasons not to find out. You might not want to find out now, but you may want to find out in 5 years. Are you about to start a family? Are you about to go to medical school? Would not knowing make you symptom hunt every day? You'd be anxious every time you dropped your spoon or fumbled a word or tripped over your own shoes. Could you live with not knowing? It's complicated. And so I did want to show that dynamic among the siblings, which is why made this, in some sense, I made this family an Irish Catholic family from Charlestown. There's 4 siblings, all in their 20s, who all have to wrestle with this tough question of, do I want to know? So yeah, I have 2 of them want to find out, and how that impacts their lives immediately, even though they do not have Huntington's now. And then one sibling chooses not to know. And then there's Katie, and we don't know her answer. And interestingly, some of the folks I interviewed, like a family where this one woman was the only member of her family who's gene negative. And you think that must feel amazing to be her. She's off the hook. And there's so much survivor's guilt. So knowing this information, there's a double-edged sword to this.
John, I wonder if you'd slow down some of that genetics and talk about why, in this condition particularly, the testing is something that a young adult would consider in terms of when the disease manifests, and how having the gene mutation might not necessarily be the same thing as having Huntington's yet. Sort of restating what Lisa's talking about, but just could you give us even some more details or slow that down a little bit?
I'll try it, although Lisa was pretty good. So the last time that it was presented to me, we know the vast majority of those that are genetically at risk choose not to be tested at that given time. And as Lisa suggested, it is a tremendously personal decision. My role as the doctor taking care of that family really is to be supportive, number one. And number two is to make sure they're properly educated. And this is a very useful role for genetic counseling. Genetic counselors, as was portrayed in the book, do a very excellent job of taking the person through the education, taking the person through the thought of testing and what it means and how it would affect them if they were positive, how it would affect them if they're negative. Another point to draw, I think, and Lisa, mentioned a little bit about this, is that we know that people who are genetically at risk for Huntington's disease, that they have an elevated prevalence of depression and anxiety, whether they're gene negative or gene positive. So being in a family with Huntington's disease has those effects before you know the result. And that's something that we have to keep in mind. People have a variety of reasons for being tested or not being tested. Sometimes it's life planning. Sometimes it's family planning. Sometimes people state, well, there's no treatment right now, so there's no point in being tested. And, our job is to respect that. So our job is to respect it, whether they choose to be tested or not to be tested. And personally, I know we're probably not into this part yet, but personally, I'm very optimistic. I think there is going to be a treatment for Huntington's disease in the not too far distant future. It's not today, obviously. More work needs to be done. But when that happens, and I'm using the phrase when that happens, then everyone's going to want to be tested because it will make a difference in their lives and their families' lives and be disease modifying.
That's such a remarkable point. So we're having this conversation in 2025. The book was published in 2015, where there was not a cure, or there still is not a cure. But should that change, then the decision for testing certainly will have at least another dynamic to it. And I agree, Lisa said this so well, but I'm just going to hammer down for our listeners who don't have a background in genetics and healthcare that Huntington's is caused by what's considered an autosomal dominant gene mutation. So that means if one of your parents has it, they have a 50-50 chance of giving it to you. And then if you have it, the penetrance, meaning how likely it is to manifest in disease at some point in your life, usually in middle age, the likelihood that it will manifest is almost 100%. So this is very different than what we talked about with BRCA mutations, for example, in another episode, where the penetrance is not 100%. And so this is very much a if you have it, you will manifest disease at some point. So let's talk about what that disease actually looks like. So, Lisa, I think many people who know anything about Huntington's think about chorea, which is this uncontrollable movement that can sometimes be misinterpreted as somebody being clumsy or not paying attention or even drunk. But actually, the first symptoms you depict Joe as having are cognitive symptoms. He's a police officer and he can't find his gun getting ready in the morning, and also mood symptoms, this unprovoked or overblown rage at these small things. Why did you start with those symptoms?
Because that's what I was hearing from in the families. And so, right, interestingly, like that hallmark symptom of Huntington's when it's full blown into the disease is this loss of control of voluntary movement, a lot of involuntary movement. This, like, Huntington's chorea was the original name, and chorea means dance in Greek. And I tell folks, if you haven't seen someone with Huntington's, interestingly, gosh, probably a couple decades ago now, Michael J. Fox, even I think in his documentary on Parkinson's, when he's being treated for Parkinson's, if you sort of you want to treat for Parkinson's, which you become rigid in your movement and unable to have that fluidity of movement and voluntary movement. And if you're taking medication for it, the ideal dose would get you to just be naturally fluid. But if they overshoot a little, or if he starts to develop some tolerance to it, he's kind of all over the place in his seat. And so people with Huntington sort of move a lot and their face twitches a lot and they might fall out of their chair. So that's the hallmark symptom, but that's not usually the first presentation, is what I was hearing from most folks. And it's only in looking back that they can see this, what they call a prodromal period, which is these more cognitive and behavioral and emotionally driven symptoms. So executive function problems. So they're having problems planning, problem solving, making decisions. So they're making mistakes and how did I organize myself? Like, where did I put my stuff? And like, they're late for work because they can't process the steps properly to get out of the house and get to work on time. Explosions of rage, paranoia. There's the person was just sort of acting uncharacteristically, blowing up or just like late for things. Like, I can't count on this person. And so people would chalk it up to a character flaw. Like, oh, he's just being a jerk for a while. So it's in looking back that folks often said, oh, actually, that was the beginning of the disease. And it can be 10, 20 years before you start to see those obvious symptoms of chorea.
Hey, listeners, we hope you're enjoying this episode of Read, Talk, Grow. If you find our discussions helpful and insightful, please take a moment to subscribe to and rate Read, Talk, Grow on your preferred podcast platform. And don't forget to tell your friends to listen. Your support will help us reach more readers and those eager to learn about health through books. As always, feel free to drop us a line at readtalkgrow@mayo.edu with suggestions for books, topics, or any comments. Thanks for listening. John, is that what you see in your practice? About what age do you start to see people come in with clear symptoms? And are there other symptoms we haven't mentioned yet?
Yeah. No, I see, and I think, what the literature say. I mean, it's middle age, 45 is an average, but there's quite a lot of variation. But to build on what Lisa was saying, is that the symptom onset is so insidious to the point where people, they don't necessarily think that something's wrong. Uncle Joe's a little fidgety, he's just, he's been that way as long as I've known. Or, somebody has a temper episode and say, well, John was just having a bad day. So lots of other explanations for things until it gets to a point where it happens to a greater degree or it happens more often that either the family or the person themselves thinks it's time to come see, a doctor or neurologist. But it's very and it's insidious. It's very slow.
I will say also that people also talked about self-medicating. So a lot of times someone will notice that something is strange about, I'm more fidgety than I used to, or I'm dropping things, and maybe my job requires me not to drop things, or it's like things are going wrong a little bit, and it's worrisome. And so maybe people start drinking a bit to sort of anesthetize, self-medicate, and then people assume that you're maybe, you're slurring over some of your words a little, or you're being more clumsy, or the explosions in temper are due to the alcohol. So there's a sort of misdirection in what's the root cause for a bit, where people just assumed it was a drinking problem.
Well, and tragically, this is what happened to Joe's mom, that he realizes in the course of the novel that he's been told this story that his mother drank herself to death. And as he starts to manifest symptoms and speak to a neurologist, he realizes she had undiagnosed Huntington's, which is so heartbreaking. And you do have several characters. For example, Joe eventually has to tell the department, the police department, what's going on beyond just a couple trusted friends. He has to tell his supervisor because there are people calling in saying there's a drunk police officer directing traffic. So I think you're right that there's this manifestation that could be interpreted as being somebody having been drinking alcohol, but then also because of the twitchiness might get suppressed by drinking alcohol. And so there might be sort of a combination going on in there. But how tragic about his mom.
Yeah, and not uncommon if you look a generation back. We didn't have as many physicians who had ever seen Huntington's. Again, it's not that common of an illness, so some wouldn't really know it if it came across, especially early on. And yeah, we do a much better job today of recognizing Huntington's and knowing how to treat people with a little more dignity. But yeah, generation ago it was, oh, mom went crazy. They put her in a mental institution. They put her in the state hospital.
Yeah, and I would even go as far as to say is perhaps a generation ago, misdiagnosis was often the rule rather than the exception. It's much better now, but part of that misdiagnosis would be fed by that Huntington's disease within families just wasn't talked about. It was not a condition that you would tell your child about, or that grandma would tell the mother or father about. It just wasn't really spoken of, even if they understood it to be what it was.
Well, and many patients with Huntington's will end up needing care beyond what they can be provided for at home. And so, not a great word, but end up, a generation ago being institutionalized because there were these outbursts and the mental health aspects and the cognitive aspects. And particularly if you didn't know what was going on, they would be placed into these care facilities. So I think that also limits historically what people have shared in families because unfortunately, there's been shame around that as well. Again, historically. John, you talked a bit about the mental health component to being in a family affected by Huntington's. I wonder if you'll also talk about a really difficult topic, which is suicidality, particularly in those who are aware they have the gene mutation even before they've manifested severe symptoms.
Thank you. We talk about it a lot with our families, with our patients, with the support groups. Anybody with an ear that is connected to the Huntington's disease community, you have to, as their physician, go over this, whether they bring it up or not, whether you even think they're depressed or not, or anxious or not. It's your duty to delve into it every single time, and as well as recruit the family to also do the same thing for that individual family member, because it is still a big problem. It also is a major topic for the genetic counselor. And in our protocol, as in the protocol that was displayed in the book, a person considering genetic testing does need to talk to a psychologist or a psychiatrist so it can be assessed where that risk is. So it's a very important part of taking care of people and families with Huntington's disease. It's a very important part of how we interact with them.
Lisa, I think this just was so brave that you took this head on and necessary, but I think a lot of writers would have ducked away from it because it is such a difficult component of Huntington's, as it was with Maddie in bipolar disorder. So thank you for always.
Thank you. And Allison's still Alice, right? I mean, this is what, again, I am committed to trying to tell the truth under the imagined circumstances. And so when I'm hearing from people over and over that this is a real risk, people are saying, like, I'm considering it or I have considered it, it's not something that I feel I could shy away from and still tell the truth. So, yeah, it was definitely something that Joe at times wrestled with and thought this is my way out. And then there's a part in the book that I'm really proud of, that I love, that like his daughter Katie sort of comes upon him when he's suicidal. I think it's the next day she talks to him. It's been a while since I wrote this. And she says, Dad, we don't know how to do this. Like, you're the example. Like, you've taught us how to ride our bike, how to do so many things. Like, we're going to look to you to see how to live and die with Huntington's. And like, you're teaching us. So what is it you want to show us? And that really spoke to him. I think that interaction and connection with his daughter really saved him in that moment in his life and allowed him to push past that and find meaning in having Huntington's, right? Find meaning in living with this. As horrible as it is, can two things be true, right? Can this be horrible and can it have meaning for my children? And can I do this as well as possible for them?
That was really lovely and really important for Katie too, which listeners will have to read the book to find that out. John, we talked about there not being a cure yet for Huntington's disease, but there certainly are treatments. And one of the treatments that Joe begins immediately is intensive physical therapy. Why is that so important, particularly early on in disease manifestation?
Anybody who has any type of problem with motor control, whether it's hand dexterity, whether it's balance or walking, physical therapy is a must, because what the underlying condition is trying to do is to decondition the person to make their brain forget how to do movements properly. And physical therapy is the number one help, if you will, with making sure that they remain their conditioning. Their brain remembers how to do certain movements. If that doesn't happen, it begins to be kind of a reverberating cycle on itself, if you will. You get deconditioned, you get less well, you're less able to mitigate the effects of the disease. So it seems like the disease is more severe and progressing faster than what it actually is. So it kind of becomes a vicious cycle. And so physical therapy is extremely important to try to mitigate that.
I really loved how Joe was like, "I don't need physical therapy. I'm not falling down that much." And the neurologist is like, "Oh, this is exactly why you need it now, so that, just as you said, you're offsetting the progression and you're already strong as the disease starts to move forward." Lisa, as an integrative medicine physician, I love that you included yoga in Joe's treatment. It wasn't recommended by his physicians, but it was recommended by his daughter, who's a yoga instructor and brings him into the practice. You're a bit of a yogi yourself, I believe. Can you comment on the healing potential of yoga?
Yes. So I have been practicing yoga since my first daughter was born in 2000. Have loved the benefits of the practice for all of this time. But when I decided to make Katie O'Brien, the daughter of Joe, so she's at risk for Huntington, she's the youngest of the four siblings who are all in their 20s, I decided to make her a yoga instructor. And the book is told in two points of view. We've got Joe's point of view and we've got Katie's, and we alternate. I did that in part because, we don't have biological medical solutions ultimately for Huntington's yet. And so the journey for folks, a healthy journey, if you will, for Huntington's is for a lot of folks a spiritual one. Like how do I make meaning out of this? How do I matter with this? How do I live each day with this? And even for the folks at risk, like part of the anxiety and the ruminating can be over what's going to happen to me 15, 20, 30 years from now. What's going to happen to me later? And so yoga is a lot about presence. And it is a lot about tapping into your intuition and learning how to be comfortable being uncomfortable. It's slowing down so that you can be attending to what is. And so the lessons that Katie was learning as a young yoga instructor were both helpful to her journey and something that she could share and connect with her father to offer him a shift in perspective that might allow him to be with his Huntington's rather than constantly feeling in a state of fight with it. So as a police officer, he was one of the training mantras for the Boston police is to stay in the fight. So whatever's happening, whatever they're called to, that they can't back away from it. They can't shy away from if there's a knife fight or a gun fight or there's a domestic call. Like they have to show up for whatever that is. So the mantra is stay in the fight. And Katie offers him maybe it could be stay in the pose. And we learned that in yoga that if you're asked to say, stay in to make the pose of warrior one or downward dog, and you're asked to hold this position, you might start to struggle physically and then you might start to struggle mentally. Your thoughts might say, when are we going to get out of this? I don't like this. I'm uncomfortable. Or you start thinking about what you're going to do later, or like, oh my, like your thoughts can start to run away from you as well. And so the idea is, can you be comfortable being uncomfortable in that pose? Can you bring your thoughts back to, oh, I'm just here in this pose. This is temporary and this too shall pass. So, yeah, I wanted some of the wisdom and the benefits of yoga to be shared from daughter to father.
I'm so glad you did, and I'm so glad that it was a character like Joe O'Brien who's practicing yoga, because you just can picture him thinking, "This is not for me," and then getting so many benefits from it.
Right, right. I did a 200-hour teacher training, yoga teacher training to, better know the yoga that Katie would be experiencing and walking. And also, this was a Catholic family that, whose faith was shaken by this. Rosie in particular was very religious, and she's like, how can I believe in a God who would do this to my family? And Katie was the youngest and sort of pursuing a life that's maybe not the life that she inherited from her family. So this story is about what we inherit. And are we free to choose a life of our own making, or are we destined to live the life we've inherited? So there's the genes we've inherited. Can't do anything about that. But we also often inherit our parents' religion, their point of view, their worldview, right? Where they live, the zip code, the expectation that maybe she should grow up and marry an Irish neighbor and live in the same neighborhood and go to the same church every Sunday. And she's the member of the family who's thinking like, well, maybe there's some other way. I like the idea of like yoga being her quote unquote religion, that I pictured her often with the mala beads and focus, the mala beads as a way to be present. And Rosie's got her rosary beads, and they're just two different ways of approaching a way to live.
It's really lovely. John, Lisa mentioned that we don't have biological and medical solutions for Huntington's, but we do have some medications that we use for symptom management. So if somebody's listening to this and thinking, oh, well, maybe I don't need to see the neurologist if they don't have something to offer me, but indeed, we have medications that can help with some of the specific symptoms, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And we have medications that can deal to some extent, as you say, in just a symptomatic way with the emotional, psychological, as well as the excessive movements. There's medications that can help with all those things, and so I think that's just one of many reasons to keep seeing a neurologist when you have Huntington's disease, because there are advances even in symptomatic treatments, occurring every year or two. And so it's very good I think, to seek treatment, both pharmacological and non-pharmacological treatment, whether it's physical therapy, yoga, seeing a psychologist. There's a whole lot of things that can be offered.
Thank you for that. And Lisa, you end the book with a call to action. You ask readers to contribute to Readers in Action funds. What is that?
So I realized after Still Alice that if I've done my job well, that readers finish my book feeling a lot. I'm asking you to feel a lot of big emotions, and there's a lot of compassion and empathy folks feel at the end of reading the story. And then I worried that, oh, but then they go about their lives and maybe they get busy and distracted and maybe not involved. So I wanted to try and catch people in that moment when they're done and feeling so many feelings, that maybe they could then go to I could point them in a direction. So for Inside the O'Briens, I point them to the Huntington's Disease Society of America, and it's a website where you can donate money toward research and resources, and it's also a place where you can find more education. So for all of the books, it's like, here's the story that I hope has given you some real education, has entertained you, and has made you feel a lot of things. And then now here's a site you can go to learn more and get involved and maybe contribute some helpful money toward research and resources.
So if our listeners are interested, we will put the link to Lisa's website in our show notes so they can learn more about Huntington's and also other conditions that Lisa covers in her books. I want to thank you both for being here to have this conversation, for your work in this challenging disease, and I hope we've inspired more listeners to go out and read Inside the O'Briens by Lisa Genova. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shanice. Thank you, John. This was great.
Thank you.
Read Talk Grow is a product of the Women's Health Center at Mayo Clinic. This episode was made possible by the generous support of Ken Stevens. Our producer is Lisa Speckhard-Pask, and our recording engineer is Rick Andreessen. Visit our show notes to see the books discussed today and for links to other health education materials. Follow us on social media like Instagram and Facebook, or reach out directly to our email, readtalkgrow@mayo.edu, with suggestions for books or topic ideas. We'd love to hear from you. This podcast is for informational purposes only and is not designed to replace a physician's medical assessment and judgment. Information presented should not be relied on as medical advice. Please contact a healthcare professional for medical assistance if needed for questions pertaining to your own health. Keep reading, everyone.